Welcome to Last Breath Woodworks. I'm Josh. In this video, we're going to be making another project out of, you guessed it, scraps. Any guesses on where these came from? That's right, the Caddy I made a couple months ago. I took all the cutoffs and diced them into little cubes, sanded the fuzzy edges off, and then I took some scrap 2x6s I had laying around, glued them together, and turned them into a 4.5-inch cylinder to use as a filler block so I didn't waste so much epoxy. Then I took that cylinder, glued it to a piece of walnut board that was left over from the base of that caddy, and secured it to the bottom of the bucket so that it didn't shift or move around, just to keep it centered. Then I just proceeded to start placing all those little scraps into the bucket around that cylinder, one piece at a time. Now, I could have just dumped them all in there willy-nilly and gave it a couple shakes to let them all settle into place, but I didn't want to waste the beauty in all these little pieces. After all, there's walnut, there's cherry, red oak, ash, and a lot of those pieces had laminate structure to them, and there was also a lot that had the walnut weaves going through them from the sides of the caddy. So I kind of wanted to put those all into place to showcase all those different wood grains and lines so that at the end it would match the details that were in that caddy. After all, this is going to be a gift to complement that caddy. There were even a few pieces of walnut dowel that were left over, so I threw them in there to kind of break up the square edges and had a little extra chaos while I was at it. It took a lot of time, but in the end, I think it was worth the effort. Now it was time to mix up the epoxy. Now I wanted to keep the wine theme going, and since this project is going to have multi-uses, it could be a cork bucket, it could be an oversized flower vase, or it could even be a champagne bucket. So I used some fine white sparkle, some coarse white sparkle, and a little bit of wine-colored tints. The aim I was going here was kind of for a look of a blush or a rosé wine, and I was hoping that those white sparkles would kind of add the effect of bubbles, like champagne bubbles. After all, if this is going to be used as a champagne bucket, it's only appropriate. Now here you can see I added some scrap pieces of pine blocks or boards that I had and taped them down with packing tape. This was just to make sure that all those scrap pieces of my cutoffs were held down and didn't float up off the bottom when I added the epoxy. Now I had mixed up a half gallon of epoxy, and you can see it clearly wasn't enough, so I mixed up another half gallon and added it before we went to the vacuum chamber. After I mixed up that second batch of epoxy, I only added about 2/3 of it to the bucket because I wanted to leave about an inch of head space so I had room for the rising and falling of the epoxy, as you can see here, when I put it under vacuum. Now there was a lot of air trapped in all those little nooks and crannies inside those blocks of scraps, and I probably cycled the vacuum on and off on this at least 12 or 15 times over the course of an hour and a half. Then once I reached full vacuum, I left it there for about a half hour and let all the air escape. You can see on the left there is one block that was kind of rising and falling a little bit, but in the end it settled down and really didn't go anywhere, so it all worked out okay in the end. After I was done with the vacuum chamber, I topped off that bucket with the remainder of the epoxy, and it was time to put it in a pressure pot and pressurize it up to 50 psi and let it sit for 3 days to cure. After 3 days, I got it out of the mold and put it on the lathe and trued it and rounded it up, and you can really start seeing all the details and beauty in those scraps coming out. Then it was just a matter of starting to whittle away and bring this piece to the shape that I wanted it. It didn't take long to whip this piece into shape. You can start seeing a nice fluted top on it with a really hefty base, which was going to be necessary if this thing was going to hold a nice tall bottle of wine or champagne in it with some ice and water in it. I didn't want it to tip over. Now you can really see all the beauty of all those different kinds of wood, the lines and laminates and inlays starting to show. And with that done, it was time to shape the bottom, put a mortise in it, and give it a nice wide foot. Now, I concave that bottom a bit before I started carving this mortise out, just so that I didn't have to worry about any wobble in it later on when it sat on the table or a counter or a shelf or anything like that. Now, I didn't want the mortise to just be ugly, so I made it not only functional but beautiful too. So I took and rounded out the center of that mortise and kind of made it like a bubble, and then sanded everything smooth so that it was ready to turn around and put it in a chuck. Once it was flipped around and in the chuck, I just used a carbide cutter to true it up again, and then sanded the entire outside from 80 grit through 220. Then I just installed the steady rest, cut off the excess of that pine cylinder, and then used a series of Forstner bits to hog out the center of this piece. And then it was just a matter of hollowing this thing out. I took my time and worked down the bottom and sidewalls to a thickness of about 3/4 inch. I kept them this thick for a couple reasons. One, to give it enough heft so that it had the weight to hold a bottle of wine or champagne, even if it tilted on its side so it wouldn't tip over. And second, so that it would give a bit of an insulating property with that thickness. Now, most of you know there's always a story behind a lot of my pieces, and this one's no different. You heard earlier that I mentioned this was going to be a gift. Well, after I made that wine caddy, my youngest daughter fell in love with it and insisted she had to have it and was willing to pay anything I wanted for it. so I sold it to her at a huge discount. And a couple weeks ago, it was her birthday, just before Christmas, and I decided to make this to go along with that Caddy, so that she had something to match it, and a piece that came from the heart, and something I made myself. Once I finished hollowing the thing out and getting the shape I wanted inside, I took the steady rest off and sanded it inside and out to 400 grit. Then I just added a nice heavy coat of thick epoxy to seal up all the wood grain and fill in any little imperfections. After all, this thing may have to hold water and ice, so it needs to be sealed up tight. After the epoxy cured overnight, I sanded everything down again to 800 grit and gave it a couple coats of poly. So at the end here, I'll throw up some glamour shots as usual. I think it turned out great. Let me know what you think in the comments. And thanks again for watching Last Breath Woodworks.